Okay, so this is what I'm going to talk about. I'm going to talk a little bit about growth, about breast milk, and about how wonderful that is. A little bit more about breast milk fortifier, and then also about formula milks, which you need to know about, and a little bit about calcium and phosphate as well. Okay, so this is a really important slide to look at. What this shows you is it shows the growth velocity of the fetus, and you can see that you grow faster than you're ever going to grow in your lifespan at about 20 weeks gestation. At birth, you are still growing faster than at any other point in your lifetime, including puberty. But at 20 weeks gestation, you're really, that's when your sort of peak growth is. If you can think about the fact that, we have babies at 24, 25 weeks gestation, they are still supposed to be growing at that rate, even though they've been delivered early. Okay, next slide. So this is really a slide showing you some data collected pre-2014, which is basically our SEND data that we all, it's being quoted on. So this is all, the data that we collect on our Badgernet, and what it shows is not how babies should grow or could grow, but how they do grow when they receive neonatal intensive care. And what it shows you is that it's about a 3 to 4 centile drop for most infants, and it's sort of the drop is more severe and more sustained the more premature you are. Next slide. So this is really the work from Nick Embleton, who sort of fired the gun on thinking about feeding in preterm infants and in babies on neonatal units. And what this slide here showed is it showed the cumulative deficit in calorie intake in babies over time. So I think the blue bars are the to get. The green bars are what you actually get, and the red bars, which are downwards, are showing your cumulative deficit. And if you remember from last week, if you think back about the fact that, when your baby is born, your 24-week plops out, it's 90% water, so there's only like one little Mars bar of baby actually there. And if you think about the fact that that Mars bar is essentially kind of shrinking rather than growing because of that cumulative calorie intake over time. Next slide. So essentially, how is growth linked to neurodevelopment? So this is quite a sort of complicated ask. This particular work shows that if you grow, the faster you grow, and if you're at the highest centiles for growth, you will be at the highest centiles for educational attainment and IQ measurements. But I'm sure all of you realize it's really not quite as simple as all that, because your sort of neurodevelopmental outcome as a neonate depends on your entirety of your neonatal experience, of which growth is a really important part, but it's not the only part. Okay. And also, we're still struggling with this question: is bigger always better? I'm sure you're all aware of the Barker hypothesis, in which Barker looked at a whole lot of adults born in, I think, Hertfordshire in the 1950s, and basically traced their growth as infants and then matched that up with their sort of outcomes as adults, and found that the infants who were born small for gestational age and then showed fast catch-up growth in the first year of life had worse cardiovascular outcomes later in life. Essentially, he designed this hypothesis of a thrifty phenotype. So in other words, if you were used in utero to receiving a lower nutrient environment and then you were placed in a nutrient-rich environment, your metabolism had been set for a thrifty environment. So you couldn't cope, so you got type 2 diabetes and cardiovascular disease. So this idea was sort of seconded by further work which was done looking at infants born in the so-called Hongerwinter, which was in World War II, when the Allies failed to liberate the northern provinces of Europe, and the people in the northern provinces in Holland not Europe, Holland, really suffered from a great starvation in that last winter before liberating, my father among them. And they found that those babies born in that hunger winter were more likely to, i.e., had been exposed to reduced nutrient intake in the womb, were more likely to develop cardiovascular disease in type 2 age. So more sort of evidence for the Barker hypothesis. And then there's some more evidence pertaining to preterm infants from User et al. There's a little bit of a spoke in the work from some recent work from a recent study from Embleton et al. Published in 2016, which showed that rather than weight gain in preterm infants up to corrected age, for example, it appeared to be weight gain which occurred after the first year of age, which sort of linked into your poorer, your greater adiposity and poorer metabolic outcomes. I think this is still something that we're talking about and that we're thinking about. So next slide. So it would appear to be, so this is, thank you Homer Simpson, that, catch-up growth is good for your neurodevelopment, but it could be bad for your metabolic outcome. Okay, next slide. So we're going to talk a little bit about feeds in newborns, mostly about breastfeeding and about some different formulas that are available in the market. Okay, so next slide. So we come to this thorny question, which is really only a thorny question in the UK, because everywhere else, people seem to breastfeed normally. Does breastfeeding really matter? And of course, from a sort of public health perspective, really matters. This headline is taken from the Lancet series of papers published out a little while ago, which shows that if you were to increase breastfeeding to near universal levels, you could save 120,000 lives a year, and that stacks up as 8,000 infant lives and 20,000 lives in terms of women who no longer get breast cancer because they've done breastfeeding. So from a public health perspective, it is one of the most important public health things that you could possibly do. Next slide. So what are the advantages of breastfeeding? This is like medical school stuff, but I'm sure you're all aware of it. Essentially, you get improved immune protection, you get improved educational attainment, you get improved brain development, you get less NEC if you're a preterm infant, you get less SIDS, and also you get lower incidence of obesity and diabetes and dental decay and things like that. So if you think about it, something that you do for a very short period in an infant's life, i.e. for the first 6 months or maybe even the first year, has sort of very long-term effect on that individual's entire health lifespan. Okay, so that's a really important thing to try and remember. And obviously, women who don't breastfeed are at higher risk of breast and ovarian cancer, and also diabetes and obesity. And I'll come back a little bit later. This is an important slide to try and remember because it kind of shows you the interplay between environment and breastfeeding. So, in other words, you have bacteria that are in a woman's environment that come into contact with the Peyer's patches, which sit in the gastrointestinal tract and also in the respiratory tract, which produces secretory IgA, which ends up in your breast milk. So as a mum, you're producing breast milk which defends you against the pathogens in your environment. So it's a very neat little package, if you like, that is produced. Right. So this package works together with the microbiome and the human milk connection. So human milk itself contains a diverse and complex microbiome and also nourishes the infant microbiome. And we now know that the early life microbiome is a subject of a lot of recent sort of research and work, and people have looked at how early life microbiome can influence your outcome in terms of a range of adult diseases and outcomes. How do you transfer your microbiome to your infant? You do that through vaginal birth, skin contact, and breastfeeding. So you should try and get at least one of those three under the, sort of in your bag if you possibly can. Okay, next slide. So what does your microbiome do for you, or what have your bacteria done for you lately? And we basically live in a synergistic relationship with our microbes, of which the vast majority live in our large bowels, and they produce certain important nutrients for us, like vitamin K, biotin, and folate. They help develop the immune system, and they also use the unabsorbed human milk oligosaccharides to produce short chain fatty acids, provide an energy source for enterocytes, and which are the cells that line the digestive tract, so help protect that barrier. They can also bind to the sites on the layer of cells lining the gut and provide a barrier in that way. And your microbiome will change as your baby grows, and that's well documented in the various bits of literature. Next slide, please. So one really special ingredient of human milk is something called human milk oligosaccharides, and there's a little picture of a snowflake there. And the reason that's there is because there are 5 different monosaccharides which come together to form these human milk oligosaccharides, which are not digested and act as a foodstuff for helpful bacteria in the gut. But they come together in lots of different ways to produce more than in excess of 200 known human milk oligosaccharides. And each woman produces a mixture of human milk oligosaccharides, which is kind of unique to her. And so essentially, this is a really kind of so that those human milk oligosaccharides will nourish your infant microbiome. Okay, people have tried to kind of like sort of replicate that in formula milk by using by taking 1 or 2 of the commonly occurring human milk oligosaccharides, putting them in formula milk, but the effect really is not the same because it's a kind of fine-tuned mechanism between mother and baby. Okay. Yeah, so essentially also human milk oligosaccharides directly protect your immune system, and by binding to sort of bad bacteria in your gut and preventing them from binding to enterocytes. So human milk oligosaccharides is like this sort of magical ingredient, and it's incredibly diverse and unique to individuals. Slide, please. So if you can just flick through these are just, this is a slide which builds up. So essentially, what you can see is you can see formula milk contains all the nutrition that human milk contains, but human milk contains a whole lot of other ingredients. And human milk is like this amazing biological soup, if you like. And it's got sort of large numbers of protective immune factors, anti-S, cytokines, anti-inflammatory cytokines, lysozyme, lactoferrin, and as you can see on that list, it really is quite remarkable. So these are just a few of the extra ingredients that you get in human milk. So human milk is much more than nutrition. It's nutrition and immune protection, and it programs your microbiome. Next slide, please. So does breastfeeding make you smarter? So this again is quite a contentious question because the way breastfeeding works out in the UK is that people, women who have a high educational level, my battery's running low. Bear with me while I just plug my computer in. Sorry about the IT issues. That should be better. Oh, no, I've lost it.
Dr. DeRooy, we can still
Hi, I'm there. I'm sorry.
we can still see and hear you. I don't. Is everything okay on your end?
I'm so sorry. I got kicked out for reasons that are not clear to me. I've plugged my computer in. Can you see me now?
We can hear you, but there's a bit of an echo.
There's an echo, isn't there? Because I think I'm logged in twice. I'm so sorry.
Your voice is perfect now.
Okay,
We can
there
hear
I
you.
am.
Thank you so much.
I'm
Sorry
just going
about
to log
that.
myself out as the other one.
Perfect.
Oh, okay. I'm gone. Right. Gosh. Feed. Right. Can you hear me?
We can
Right,
hear you and we
okay.
can see you now. Thank you.
Okay. Is that okay?
It's perfect.
All right. So, oh, I can still hear an echo. Wait, let me just try.
I didn't hear an echo. It should be fine.
Okay, good.
Unless you hear an echo on your end, but we should be fine.
Okay. So, where are we? Here. Okay. So, does breastfeeding make you smarter? So, this is contentious issue, as I was saying, because the way breastfeeding works out is that women who have got a higher educational attainment are the ones that tend to breastfeed. And so what people say is that, okay, smart mum, you breastfeed, and therefore your kids, are smarter because you read the books, and it's nothing to do with the breastfeeding. There is some evidence that says otherwise, and I've shown two bits of it here. The first bit is from Lucas et al. From that's a really old study from 90, which looked at wonderful Formula X, which was up against donor milk, preterm infant. And then they looked at the babies again at 18 months of age, and they found the babies had donor milk or all skinnier and smaller, but they outperformed wonderful Formula Milk X babies in terms of the Bailey's developmental scale. So that's a really interesting bit of work. And then the other bit here shows you brain development, or sort of especially frontal horns, frontal white matter, which is better in breastfed infants. That's a really good paper to look at. Okay, next slide. So maternal benefits, we've touched on it a little bit. You have a lower risk of breast cancer, ovarian cancer, and also you have a lower risk of obesity. And I've got a picture of swimming there. The reason for that is that lactating for a full-term infant uses equivalent to swimming 30 laps in a pool. It means that what happens is that you will lactate for your baby, you will lose the weight you put on in pregnancy. So you gain an additional 10 kg, which is not baby weight, but it's just body weight. And that body weight is there to enable you to do lactation. If you don't lactate, it's much harder to lose that weight. And you enter your next pregnancy heavier. You end up in your ages heavier than when you started, and so more at risk of obesity and cardiovascular related illnesses. Okay, fine. Oh,
Sorry, I don't know what happened.
sorry.
We're not winning.
So sorry. Sorry, guys. Okay, so societal benefits, I think you're all really, on board with. The thing to remember is you have less healthcare costs. If you manage to get all the babies in the UK breastfed, you would get much less NHS costs through infectious morbidity, first year of life, hospital admissions, also long-term in which echo on in adult life. Okay, so you could say that NHS a lot of botch. Got everyone to breastfeed. Okay, next slide. So sidestep a little bit, talk a little bit about the formula milk industry. And there's a recent report published by UNICEF, which basically shows that formula milk marketing is destabilizing people's decisions around infant feeding. And they do this because marketing is kind of pervasive, personalized, powerful. What they mean by although you're not allowed to directly advertise to consumers, people are still finding ways across multiple platforms to direct advertising at young women and young men as well. I mean, I have one daughter of childbearing age, and she's certainly subject to this pervasive marketing technique. Also, what's insidious about this marketing is that formula milk companies pretend to be your friend. You know, you have Gay Baby Club where they pretend to give you advice about infant feeding, which is not advice, propaganda. It's an advert. So it's really worthwhile remembering that. Also, it's this report. Foreign milk companies bend science, are untruthful in the way they present scientific findings, and that's certainly been well established. That's what else is to say here? So essentially, also formula milks companies are still targeting healthcare professionals. So not so much in the UK, we have a greater awareness, but in third world and developing countries, this is still going on with lots of freebies to healthcare professionals, stuff being paid for, conferences, etc., that induce healthcare to advertise particular formula brands. And then the other thing to say is that by having this sort of pervasive marketing, formula companies sort of make parents less confident about breastfeeding. So even if you start off to breastfeed, because the marketing is so powerful and so trained on you, you end up sort of giving the messages that the marketing machine is throwing at you. So the final point from the report is that they feel that countermeasures could be effective but must be scaled up. And I really think that that doesn't go far enough. I would like to, for example, no formula milk company to advertise at all, and a full adaptation of the WHO code in the UK. I think that would go some way to help level the playing field in terms of how we promote breastfeeding and how we deal with formula feeding. Okay, please. So what about breast milk for preterm baby? So lots of neonatologists are really obsessive about growth, myself included. But there's sort of widespread concern about that the fact that breast milk is not nutritionally sufficient for the preterm baby. But we do know breast milk is absolutely the best in terms of NEC prevention. It helps you with your poor innate immunity. It reduces the risk of nosocomial infection, reduces illnesses like ROP and NEC, and it gives you a big leg up. That little picture on the side there shows the transplacental transfer of IgG in the third trimester of pregnancy. So what that shows is that you don't get much from your mum until the third trimester. So if you're born without having had the third trimester, you're born with really very poor immunity, much worse than infant. And breast milk will go some way to address that inequity in immunity that preterm infants have. Okay, next. So then we come on to breast milk fortifier. And I've put there because people are not like kangaroos. So just to explain that. So when kangaroos give birth, they give birth to really immature little joeys that crawl into the pouch attach themselves to the nipple, and are fed this really nutrient-rich milk. Then as the baby gets bigger, it starts hopping out of the pouch and eating a few leaves, and then the mother's milk changes and is now less nutritious because it no longer needs to be with the sole diet of the little baby. Unfortunately, if you deliver prematurely, after the first 2 weeks, your body will lactate as if it's like a term infant. Okay, the term infant has already undergone third trimester growth spurt and no longer needs all those nutrients. Okay, so this is why we need breast milk fortifier, because breast milk is designed for infants. And this little table shows you how much your intake should be and how much there is in breast milk. So, for example, for a baby less than 2 kilogram, you're looking at needing about 4 grams per kilogram per day of a protein, and this is what's provided by preterm milk at 150 ml per kilo per day. Okay, next slide. So, what's the downside of breast milk fortifier? And I put here, hint, there is no downside. So there's a theoretical increased risk of NEC, but there's now really considerable evidence that this is not the case. There have been 2 Cochrane reviews recently updated, which found no link between the use of breast milk fortifier, which is bovine-based, and an increased risk of NEC. And the picture I've showed you is of some work we did here at St. George's, which is basically looking at this little line here is our use of bovine fortifier, and these little bars along here are the cases of NEC, with severe cases of NEC are the grey bars. Okay, and so what that really shows is that although our breast milk fortifier use has hugely increased, our rates of NEC are unchanged across a 10-year period. That is really good numerical data to kind of reassure you that bovine-based breast milk fortifier is not associated with NEC. Of course, I'm aware of the evidence from Sullivan et al. From 2010, which shows a higher incidence of any babies who were given, I think it was, what was it again, human milk and bovine fortified babies given human milk derived. But that study is quite flawed in terms of being applicable to a UK population, because the background rate of NEC within that particular population is about 10 times higher than we would find in the UK. Also, this was paid for by the people that made the human milk fortifier. Okay, so again, that evidence is doubtful. The next paper from Chandler et al. From 2005 compares the rate of NEC for babies receiving mum's milk, and then the comparison group was a group babies receiving preterm formula. So again, it was a kind of an apples and oranges comparison, and not a real sort of. And then there was also the last one from Cristallafo et al. In 2013. So next slide. So the question is, do we need human milk derived fortifier? So all of that evidence that I've showed you on the slide is really, what that shows is that at the moment there is no concern using a bovine-based milk fortifier, but there is some hint from the evidence that there could be sort of dose-dependent relationship between how much bovine product you're exposed to and your risk of any. And so I think it's right that it's further explored, and this is one of the trials going to be starting to recruit, or is already starting to recruit. I think it's in Norway, to sort of try and unpick that dose-dependent relationship between bovine products and NEC. Okay, but still the take-home message is that at the moment, bovine breast milk fortifier is a safe thing to do. Okay, next slide. So again, the perceived nutritional downfalls of breast milk fortifier, and also there was a study published by Erickson et al. In 2016, which basically raised a concern in Sweden that the use of preterm breast milk fortifier and post-discharge formulas was associated with a decrease in breastfeeding rates in Sweden and babies receiving intensive care in Sweden. So Sweden is really different in that they are a breastfeeding country. So everyone breastfeeds in Sweden, and so this is of considerable concern to them. So we looked at this in a UK context, and we did a kind of UK-wide survey to see if use of breast milk fortifier was or wasn't related to whether or not you breastfed at discharge, and it really is. So for us in the UK, seems to make no difference to your breastfeeding rates at discharge. Okay, so as I said before, what's the downside? There is no downside. Okay, next slide. So what's in breast milk? So it depends a bit on what you're using. So in the UK, it's mostly made milk, and it's mostly a protein, calcium, and vitamin supplement. It contains a little bit of carbohydrate and fat, but not particularly much. The protein component in fortifiers available in the UK is mostly hydrolyzed, and it also contains extra sodium, because sodium can be your a rate limiting factor for growth. The picture I've shown you there is really, really interesting, because that shows you that the levels of zinc in human as a length of treated. So that's not so important for term infants, because you're exclusively breastfed until 6 months, and then you start to eat other foods which contain zinc. So that's a really well-designed system for term infants. But for preterm babies, where lactating for 6 months, but your baby is still only just term-corrected age, that's not such. Zinc is another one of those key deficiencies that you get in babies who receive fortified human milk. Next slide. So what's in fortified maternal breast milk? As I said, a little bit of extra carbohydrates, a little bit of extra fats, really not very much, and the major increase is in protein, and obviously the zinc and the phosphate for bones. Next slide. So does everybody do the same thing? And the answer is no. Most people in the UK do standard fortifiers. So in other words, you add a little sachet which gives you a standard amount of protein, carbohydrates, electrolytes, calcium, phosphate, vitamins, zinc, etc. The really easy thing about that is that your calcium and phosphate component come in exactly. Okay, so that's super easy. Adjustable fortification. This is a modifier, and you use kind of like a biomarker as a kind of marker for how much protein you need. For example, your serum urea level, and then you add extra protein into milk which has already got standard fortification, and that's another approach. It's more work, and because it's more work, more expensive, so not that commonly done. Target fortification is this really, really interesting idea whereby you analyze that particular mum's milk, add in the thing that you need to add in, for example, more protein, more carbohydrate, whatever. The problem is analyzers that we have available for human milk are derived for the dairy industry, and cows don't make milk, human milk oligosaccharides, which is a big component of your carbohydrates in human milk. So the carbohydrate and total calorie components calculation that you get from those analyzers is just not accurate enough to do this with confidence. So it is an interesting idea. Maybe we'll sort it out in future. Okay. So who should get breast milk fortifier? So essentially all babies who have a birth weight of less than 1,500 grams. And this is because you have a greater nutrient deficit that you're needing to catch up if you're less than that birth weight. And in the we mostly start breast milk fortifier once full feeds are established. So this is different from European and American practice, where variably fortifier is started at 70 or 100 ml per kilo per day. So that is a slight difference to bear in mind, and maybe that will be doing that in the future. Watch this space basically. For babies who are more than that birth weight, you can still be needing fortification, but then you can do it on a more as needed basis. So you can look at serum urea, look at weight gain, you can look at linear growth, and you can fortification on the basis of those things. Okay, next slide. So the thing also to say is that although I've gone on and on and on about breastfeeding, the UK is still a formula feeding nation, and it's really, really important that we never mistake the fact that breastfeeding is a really good public health initiative versus the fact that not all women have a smooth breastfeeding journey. Okay, and that if people stop breastfeeding at some point in the journey, we should try and support them in their choices and not try and make them feel even more bad. And the reason for that, said a lot of times, oh, breast is best, you must breastfeed, blah, blah, blah. And then we give people absolutely no help to do breastfeeding. If you deliver a term, it's thrown out of the hospital 6 hours later, and then your midwife doesn't come to visit you for 3 days. And you're supposed to make up the breastfeeding thing as you go along in the meantime. So we are asking women to accomplish a lot. So on the one hand, we're kind of going, oh, breast is best, but if you fail breastfeed, it's your fault. So it's really a poor system at the moment. Formula feeding families need our help and support as much as breastfeeding families. And this is why I want to signpost you to website here, which is called First Steps Nutrition Trust. It gives really good information for formula families. So it debunks a lot of myths about formula milks, and gives some super good advice how to wean your baby. If you want a vegan toddler, for example, all that stuff is on there. It's really, really good. Have a look. So the major message, sorry, the major messages from First Step Nutrition Trust is that all you need for a formula-fed infant, first stage baby milk, which you can use for the first year of life. And you don't need follow-on milk, and you don't need hungry baby milk, whatever, or none of those things are there's no evidence for any of that stuff. Okay, good. Let's have a look at the next slide. Sorry. So we then also have formulas available to us, which are especially for the purpose of improving absorption and digestion for shortcut, or for babies with a functional shortcut. And you should sort of be aware of what those are. So I've given you the little picture of a lipid, which I showed you last week as well, which is basically a glycerol acid chain attached. And the reason I've showed you that picture is because a medium chain triglyceride is a carbon chain, a carbon fatty acid chain, which is between 6 and 10 carbon atoms. Okay, so that's a medium chain triglyceride. Why are they important? Because they're absorbed differently. So long chain are formed in macrons, which are absorbed in the lacteals and then go into the lymphatic system, whereas medium chain are absorbed straight into the bloodstream, and they're absorbed from the stomach, upper small intestine. So they are much more readily absorbed for babies where there is like an intestinal problem. That you don't need bile salts to emulsify them and then to absorb them in the lower intestine. What you should remember that medium chain triglycerides are less calorific than your long chain carbon atoms, and that's because there's less carbon bonds to be broken down. It's a simple mathematics. The example I give of a medium chain oil is coconut oil, which has got purported various health benefits for adults as well. I'm sure you're aware of this. It's meant to help you feel more full after, and because it's got a lesser calorie content than other fats, it's thought to help with weight loss. A slight caveat to be aware of is that you do need to eat at least carbon 18 acids, which are your essential fatty acids, your linoleic and linolenic fatty acids. Okay, so in order for you to all your long chain fatty acids that you need. So don't go away and only eat that oil from please. Okay, next slide. So proteins, as you all know, proteins are complicated quaternary structures which are then denatured by gastric acid into chains of amino acids, and those amino acids are then chopped into peptides and then chopped into amino acids which are then absorbed. Okay, so we know that extensively hydrolyzed formulas are when the protein is chopped up into peptides, and that does make digestion and absorption much easier. There is no evidence for the so-called partially hydrolyzed formulas. There is no evidence to suggest those formulas have allergy, and there's no evidence to suggest that they're any better for preterm infants, okay, or for term infants matter. Okay, so yes to extensively hydrolyzed formulas for patients with a particular problem, and yes to entirely hydrolyzed formulas, like, for example, Neonatal, the protein is chopped up into amino acids. Great, next slide. So your specialist formulas are these. They are infant treatment with a high formula, and so most formulas work out at about 0.7 kilocalories per mil, but infant creamy works out at 1 kilocalorie per mil, which is really useful. You have a baby that's got a really high energy requirements, but a limited tolerance of volume. Okay, for example, children who are short of chronic lung disease. Infant creamy Captisol also super useful. So here, the protein component is extensively so easier to absorb, and you've got part of your fat component as MTP, so also good for people with small intestinal problems. Progesterone again is extensively hydrolyzed with some MCT, but it's not a high calorie milk. And then Neocate is the one that's chopped into amino acids and also has a little bit of MCT. Monogen is a milk which has its major fat source as MCT, but remember what I said about it can't be on that long term because you get essential deficiency. Okay, great. Next slide. So other formula milks. So I've put up here a picture of an advert for follow-on milks, which apparently appears to suggest that if you give your baby this particular brand of follow-on milk, they will grow up into a ballerina. Okay, none of that is true. Okay, you don't need follow-on milks. You only need first year of life. After that, you can go on to doorstep full-fat dairy milk with food and vitamins. And you certainly don't need growing up milk. So follow-on milk, growing up milk, is a formula milk industry's a sort of cynical attempt to increase market share. If people ask you about that, be really, really clear that they are not needed. Thank you. Next slide. So this slide is about breastfeeding babies after discharge. And essentially, the longer you breastfeed your preterm infant, the higher the quartile of cognitive development. And this was this particular work published in 2013. It goes from never breastfed to breastfed for a prolonged period of time after discharge. So that really indicates to us that if you can support breastfeeding after discharge, this would be a really helpful thing for their neurocognitive outcome. Next slide. So how do you support breastfeeding after discharge? Because this is quite a difficult ask because we are discharging premature babies earlier and earlier, okay, which is a good thing because being at home with your mum and dad is much better than being in a unit. But breastfeeding is a supply and demand system. Okay, and as a preterm infant, you may not be able to demand all the nutrition that because you haven't got enough oomph because you're just too preterm. And for that reason, we've now started the practice of giving breast milk fortified shots or bombs or whatever you want to call them. And basically, you dissolve 3 or 4 sachets of breast milk fortifier in a little bit of breast milk and give that as a kind of dose to the baby 4 times a day with normal breast. Okay, and that's a way of supplementing your protein and especially your bone mineral content for breast support, and it hopefully allows you to breastfeed for longer, having to resort to a post-discharge formula. Also, the other sort of thing is that psychological message behind using breast milk fortifier shots discharge is far less about undermining breastfeeding, because if you go, oh yeah, breastfeed, but give this amazing formula milk top-up formula feed, then people are going to start losing faith in breastfeeding and it's gradually going to decline. The last point on the slide is about a lean, keen breastfeeding machine. So what that's about is to our breast tend to be leaner and longer by the end of their first year of life. Okay, and that is what you want to be encouraging. So you don't want your pre to they don't need to catch up weight aggressively if they're breastfed, because they will still be getting that neurocognitive leg up from breastfeeding. That's so important. Okay, great. Next slide. So this is sorry, about post-discharge formulas. And essentially, there isn't good evidence to support this practice at all. And the only time I ever do post-discharge is when there has been a huge sort of nutritional deficit that you are trying to catch up, and that's still not caught up by the discharge time. Okay. So a little bit about calcium and phosphorus. So as I said in my last talk, your major part of skeletal mineralization happens in the third trimester of pregnancy. If you miss your third trimester, you're going to miss all that bone mineralization. And also calcium, phosphate, and magnesium is transported across the placenta against a concentration gradient. So basically, fetuses are really good parasites in terms of building up their bones at the expense of their mums. Okay, it's actually super difficult to get the same accretion rate than phosphate for your preterm baby, no matter what you do, because of solubility constraints within your PN. So you can't get enough calcium and phosphate in your PN, and also you can't put too much calcium supplements in your milk because you could cause milk curd obstruction, and that's certainly been well described with both formula fed and babies fed human milk with fortifier. So what do? We essentially provide a balanced fortifier, a multi-nutrient fortifier. Okay, and you can see at the bottom of the slide, there's a rate of fetal accretion, there's what you get with EBM, there's what you get with fortifier. So you get, you're supposed to get 2 millimole per kilogram per day of calcium, and with EBM and fortifier, you get 2.55 millimole per kilogram per day. Phosphorus is the same, and the calcium to phosphate ratio in a multi-nutrient fortifier is exactly correct for how it should be. Okay, great. Next slide. So we all come across these babies where your alkaline phosphatase is raised, and it's worth remembering that your alkaline phosphatase should be raised, okay, because you're trying to grow some bone. So hence the high alkaline phosphatase. If it's low, you need to worry about the fact that you're not giving enough bone minerals to grow some bones, or there's something else stopping you growing some bones. However, if it's more than 900, you need to kind of rethink it a bit and you go back and check what you're giving. You need to be giving plenty of substrate, calcium, phosphate, and vitamin D. So, for example, fully fortified mum's milk with an additional vitamin supplement will give you that. Okay. You can also then check parathyroid and vitamin D levels. If your vitamin D level is low, give more vitamin D. And then what do you do with your PTH levels, your parathyroid hormone levels? Next slide. So as we said before, parathyroid hormone very tightly controls your serum calcium. Okay, if your parathyroid hormone is raised, that means that your baby is trying to mobilize calcium in various ways. It's trying to increase calcium absorption from the gut, and it is also mobilizing calcium from the skeleton, called secondary hyperparathyroidism. Okay? And it suggests that you don't have enough calcium. Okay, so if that is the case, you've got a low, normal, or whatever phosphate, you've got a high PTH level, you need to start thinking about adding in calcium supplements, but you need to keep within those ratios. In other words, it needs to be 1.5 and to 1.7 to 1 in terms of calcium to phosphate ratio. You need to go back to what it is you're giving in your mum's milk with your fortifier, and then work out what you can do accordingly in terms of calcium supplements. If your PTH is normal or low, it suggests that you haven't got enough phosphate. Again, consider giving additional phosphate supplements, but again, keeping that balance ratio. Okay, great. Next slide. So I just wanted to signpost you to this particular paper, which is in archives, which I think is a really good kind of like explanation of PTH, phosphate, calcium business. So go look at that. Okay, much better than my explanation. Okay, so this is my last slide. Be happy to hear. So human milk is obviously, I mean, I've said a lot about human milk and breastfeeding. It's the food of choice for babies, and it is the food of choice for preterm babies. But you do need breast milk fortifier, and you do need extra vitamins as well. Okay, and this is a picture of a baby getting their microbiome sorted out. Any questions? I'm sorry about the technical issue.